All right, and this video here just wrapping up chapter 21 about our blood vessels and circulation. How do we regulate blood pressure, or that mean arterial pressure? So we know that it has to stay within a normal range. So we don't want to have too high or too low of blood pressure. This is one of the first vital signs that's taken because we need to keep it in a specific range. Otherwise, circulatory shock can occur, and circulatory shock is whenever we don't have enough blood flow throughout the body that causes the failure of different systems and ultimately can lead to death. So if it's too high, the heart and the blood vessels can get damaged because of the pressure buildup. It can cause a lot of damage to the heart. Of course, it can lead to a heart attack and other problems as well. So if we look at calculating that mean arterial pressure, it's just a little bit less than the average of our systolic and diastolic pressures. Essentially, over our lifetime, it's going to continue to increase. Only about 70 around birth, 100 most of our kind of adolescence to middle age, and then up to 110 for healthy older individuals. And it's calculated in one of two ways, either cardiac output times the resistance, or we can look at heart rate times the stroke volume times that resistance, because heart rate times the stroke volume is our cardiac output. So it's all proportional. So if any of those three go up, then our pressure goes up. So if we look at that short-term regulation of blood pressure, mainly we're using baroreceptor reflexes, and those are going to change or are going to recognize changes in resistance, the heart rate, and stroke volume. All of those changes would be recognized by those reflexes to change the blood pressure. Then we have the adrenal medulla mechanism, and this is more for extremes. So this is activated in substantial increase in sympathetic stimulation, such as a large decrease in blood pressure, a lot of increase in exercise, or very stressful. So this is kind of a substantial sympathetic stimulation would then activate the adrenal medulla. We also have chemoreceptor reflexes, and this is where we have sensory receptors that are sensitive to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH levels that would all indicate a change or a need to change that blood pressure. And then finally, our central nervous system ischemic response, and this results whenever we have too much carbon dioxide or a low pH, because carbon dioxide combines with water in our blood. So if we have too much carbon dioxide, so if we're like holding our breath, we have too much carbon dioxide building up, not enough oxygen coming in, but that increased carbon dioxide then causes our pH to lower because it creates carbonic acid. So those will be detected by this ischemic response, and that would then increase that peripheral and an increase in peripheral resistance. All right, so just looking at more specifics about this baroreceptor reflex. So if we start here at the aortic arch, so these baroreceptors, and essentially they're looking kind of at pressure, and really what they're looking at is the stretch. So there's always a partial stretch during normal blood pressure, so that there's a constant flow of action potentials. So it's constant, but kind of a low frequency. If there's an increase in the pressure, though, in the blood vessel, that stretches the vessel walls, which is going to increase the action potentials. So as the walls stretch, it increases the number of action potentials that's produced by those baroreceptors. And then on the other hand, if there's a decrease in the blood pressure, then the walls aren't being stretched as much. That's going to decrease the frequency of those action potentials of the baroreceptors. Okay, so then what does all that do? So then changes in that frequency of action potential. So again, if the pressure is high and that stretch and frequency is increasing, that gets detected by the cardioregulatory and vasomotor centers there in that medulla oblongata, so shown in here. All right, so in response to that increase in blood pressure, that center in the medulla is going to decrease the sympathetic stimulation. So that's going to decrease like epinephrine and norepinephrine from being released. And then also in the medulla, it increases parasympathetic stimulation of the heart. So we're going to go more to that rest digest, so decreasing the heart rate, which then decreases the blood pressure. Now, if the blood pressure is low and those baroreceptors decrease the frequency of action potentials, we're still taking that information back to that cardioregulatory center, but now we're going to increase sympathetic stimulation and decrease parasympathetic, which will increase the heart rate, the stroke volume, and therefore the blood pressure. So also responding to a decrease, that vasomotor center increases sympathetic stimulation and causes vasoconstriction to increase the blood pressure. So when the blood pressure drops, both the cardioregulatory center and that vasomotor center are going to get activated to increase sympathetic stimulation. All right, so just a visual here of what we just talked about, looking at it in just a slightly different way. All right, so we're going to start here with our blood pressure. So what happens, we'll start at the top here. So if we have an increase in blood pressure, again, as we just said, what's going to happen, those baroreceptors are going to increase in their frequency because they're going to get stretched. So we increase the action potentials at those baroreceptors due to that. So that's going to signal to that cardioregulatory center to increase parasympathetic stimulation and decrease sympathetic. So both of those events are going to bring down the blood pressure. So that vasomotor center also decreases sympathetic stimulation. So again, that's that baroreceptor reflex. So as the frequency and action potentials increases, the cardioregulatory and vasomotor decrease sympathetic stimulation. So then in response to that, that heart rate, stroke volume decrease, and our blood vessels dilate, which is going to bring down the blood pressure to normal. So we restore that. Now, on the other hand, if the blood pressure decreases, then essentially the opposite happens. Those baroreceptors are going to decrease the action potential. They sense that decrease in blood pressure. That's going to trigger that cardioregulatory center to decrease parasympathetic and increase sympathetic stimulation. Again, that baroreceptor reflex. Changing in action potentials alters both the vasomotor center and the cardioregulatory center to cause that effect. In addition, the adrenal medulla increases secretions of epinephrine and norepinephrine if it gets too low, which is that adrenal medullary mechanism, and that's going to cause blood vessel constriction to increase blood pressure. All right, so just kind of looking a little bit more specifically at that adrenal medullary mechanism. Again, this is activated when the stimuli from that substantial increase in sympathetic stimulation. So again, a huge increase in that stimulation of the heart and the blood vessels. So again, a huge change or drop in the blood pressure or sudden physical activity or stress. That's going to trigger this adrenal medullary mechanism, and that causes the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So that mimics, those hormones then mimic the sympathetic stimulation of the heart. It's just using more of a hormonal mechanism than necessarily the neural response. All right, now we also have that chemoreceptor reflex. Again, and this is looking at oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. So decreases in oxygen or an increase in carbon dioxide or a decrease in pH, those are going to decrease the parasympathetic to increase the heart rate. So if we don't have enough oxygen or we have too much carbon dioxide, which lowers the pH, we need to increase the heart rate. We need to get more blood pumping. And then a decrease in oxygen, again, increase in carbon dioxide or decrease in pH, also increases the sympathetic stimulation. That's going to increase the heart rate and stroke volume to increase that cardiac output, that then also increases our heart rate or the arterial pressure. So we get an increase of heart rate because we're decreasing parasympathetic stimulation, and then we're increasing heart rate and stroke volume by increasing sympathetic. So those combine to increase cardiac output and increase that MAP, that mean arterial pressure. So again, that increase in sympathetic increases vasoconstriction. That's going to increase that blood flow to tissues that are not constricted, like the brain and our cardiac muscle. All right, now that ischemic response, again, elevations of the blood pressure. This is due to a lack of blood flow to that medulla oblongata. So again, kind of a lack of oxygen essentially to the brain sets off the CNS ischemic response. So this functions in response to emergency situation where that blood pressure drops below 50. And here what's going to happen are the neurons of that vasomotor center get strongly stimulated to increase blood flow to the brain, as long as those vessels are intact, but it also decreases oxygenation of the blood because the blood's not going to the lungs. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there a little bit. So a lack of oxygen causes the vasomotor center to become inactive, and then extensive vasodilation follows that commitment or concomitant drop in the blood pressure. And then death if that response lasts longer than a few minutes, because we can't go, of course, without oxygen or too much of a drop in that blood pressure. All right, so if we kind of look at the summary here of that short-term regulation, so each of those four regulatory mechanisms are important, so it's not like one's more important than the other. But most circumstances during the day, we're mainly using that baroreceptor. It's not that it's more important, it's just kind of the normal mechanism. Then the adrenal medullary mechanism is more during emergencies or exercise when we get huge drops in the blood pressure. The chemoreceptor mechanism is more whenever we're looking at changes in the oxygen levels, like being at high altitudes, and we get that elevation in carbon dioxide or decrease in the pH. And then the ischemic response is activated only on rare, again important, but in rare emergency situations whenever the blood's getting too little oxygen and we're trying to save the body, save the brain at the expense of the rest of the body, essentially. So now what about long-term regulation? So there are three mechanisms. So we have 4 for the short term, 3 for the long term. So regulation of blood concentration and volume by the kidneys, and then movement of fluid across the blood vessels, and then alternations in the volume of the blood vessels. So some of these long-term mechanisms begin to respond in minutes, but then they last for a long time. So it's not that it's a delayed response, it's just regulating it for a longer period. So then we have this renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, which is one of the main long-term kind of pathways. So here we're using the kidneys to regulate the blood pressure by altering blood volume through the production of urine. So the kidneys change blood volume by altering urine production. So what happens is as the blood volume and the pressure increase, then the urine volume is also going to increase. So the increased output of urine decreases blood volume, because so essentially taking the fluid from the blood and excreting it as urine. So that decrease in blood volume also then alters the blood pressure. So when the blood volume and the pressure decrease, then urine production decreases. And then we get the opposite effect. Now decreased urine output increases blood flow and the blood pressure goes back up. So we have this kind of cyclic process happening. So this renin-angiotensin aldosterone helps regulate blood pressure, again, by altering that blood volume. So how does it actually work? So what's happening here, so if we have a decrease in blood pressure, the kidney is going to release an enzyme called renin, from structures called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. So they release this enzyme. Again, most enzymes end with ASE, but renin is an exception. So the kidneys excrete renin from this juxtaglomerular apparatus. Now, what does renin do? So whenever it's released into the blood, it essentially acts as a plasma protein. Okay, so this is then made in the liver, so it is going to act as a protein that's synthesized by the liver, and that protein is called angiotensinogen, and it's split into fragments off one of the ends. Okay, so the fragment is called angiotensin 1, and it has only 10 amino acids, so it's a really short protein. But again, so whenever renin gets released, we act as a plasma protein, and then we get in the liver, when it gets synthesized, as angiotensinogen. We split that into fragments, and one of those fragments is called angiotensin 1. Now we have another enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme, which is mainly in our blood vessels of the lung. It gets cleaved or spread apart into two different amino acids from angiotensin 1 to produce a smaller fragment called angiotensin 2, which is the active angiotensin. All right, so then what? All right, well, that angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction of the arterioles and a little bit to the veins, but that's going to increase the resistance and venous return, which are going to increase that blood pressure. So kind of all of that, again, this is in response to low pressure. So all of that to get an increase in angiotensin 2, we constrict the arterioles and increase blood pressure. Now it also stimulates a molecule called aldosterone that's secreted from the adrenal cortex. And then aldosterone acts on the kidneys to decrease reabsorption of ions, essentially salt, sodium and chloride ions from the fluid. So if antidiuretic hormone is present, then water moves by osmosis with the sodium and the chloride ions. So ultimately, aldosterone causes the kidneys to retain solutes. And as a result, due to osmosis, that's going to increase blood volume. So the water is going to stay in the blood vessels trying to dilute out that extra sodium and chlorine, and that's going to cause the blood pressure to go up. So then angiotensin 2 increases also that salt appetite. It makes us kind of thirsty, makes us want to, we kind of crave salt, and it increases that antidiuretic secretion. Right, so this secretion of renin, again, is dependent on changes of the blood pressure. So it's released when the blood pressure, again, decreases, and when the blood pressure increases, its amount is going to decrease. So it's essentially the opposite, that the blood pressure goes up, then we decrease it. If it goes down, we increase secretion of renin. So it's opposite effects. And then that angiotensin converting enzyme, the ACE, there are inhibitors of that that are a drug used to treat hypertension. So it offsets the action of that enzyme that normally is decreasing that is normally increasing our blood pressure. So by inhibiting that enzyme, it helps to bring the blood pressure down. So we have a lot of drugs that are ACE inhibitors. All right, now what about the antidiuretic hormone? So we have osmoreceptors that detect that increase in osmotic pressure. Again, we already talked about our baroreceptors here, but either one of those activate the hypothalamus. That stimulates the posterior pituitary that increases the release of antidiuretic hormone. And it has two effects. It increases reabsorption of water by the kidneys, so that's going to increase blood volume. And then it also is going to cause vasoconstriction of the blood vessels. So both that increase in blood volume and that direct increase in blood pressure. We also have the atrial natriuretic mechanism, or the ANH, And this is whenever we get this this hormone that gets released from the cardiac muscles from the atria, hence the name, when the venous return increases. So if we have a lot of blood coming back into the heart, so that venous return, blood coming to the heart, this hormone gets released. It acts on the kidneys to increase our urine production. So if we have too much fluid coming into the heart, we need to decrease blood volume. So we do that by increasing urine output. That also results in a loss of sodium that goes along with the water. It also dilates those arteries and veins to bring the blood pressure down. So that loss of water and sodium in the urine, though, decreases the blood volume and therefore decreases that venous return. Okay, and then that vasodilation results in a decrease of resistance. So overall, that decrease in venous return and decrease in resistance will drop the blood pressure. All right, now what about our next one here, the fluid shift mechanism? So this is in response to small changes in blood pressure across the capillaries. So working more here at the capillary impacts. So as the blood pressure increases, some of the fluid gets forced into the capillaries in that interstitial space. So movement of fluid from those spaces into capillaries occurs in response to a decrease in blood pressure to maintain that blood volume. And this starts to act immediately, but again, it's in the long-term section because it requires hours for it to reach its full effect. So it starts quickly, it just takes a while for it to cause an impact. We also have the stress relaxation response. So this is characteristic of smooth muscle fibers. So we're talking about cardiac muscles. Well, this is our smooth muscle fibers. So its adjustment of blood vessels is in response to a change in blood volume. So when the volume suddenly declines, the pressure drops, those muscles are going to contract to increase the blood pressure. If it's increased, then those muscles relax to decrease the blood pressure. So controlling that smooth muscle fiber, or those smooth muscle fibers to alter the blood volume. All right, so we kind of look at the summary here of all these long-term pressures. So again, here we have our disruption here. So our pressure in this case is increased. So again, the receptors and the control center, so that atrial natriuretic mechanism, we're going to release in those cardiac muscles, we're going to release that hormone. We also get the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism here in our kidneys that detects that increased pressure, and it's going to produce ultimately that angiotensin 2, and aldosterone gets secreted from the adrenal cortex. That secretion is going to decrease. So overall, from those, we get vasodilation decreases that resistance to the blood flow. We get more sodium and water are lost in the urine, so increasing urine input to decrease blood volume. That's going to decrease our blood pressure and bring it back to normal. Now on the other side, if the blood pressure decreases, now we're going to, in that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone, the kidneys detect that decrease in blood pressure, and now it's going to produce angiotensin 2, and the secretions of aldosterone are going to increase instead of decreasing. And then we have that antidiuretic or vasopressin, where those baroreceptors are going to detect that change in blood pressure. We get a decreased stimulation of the hypothalamus, and that's going to increase the antidiuretic secretion in the posterior pituitary. And then that antidiuretic hormone ultimately is going to cause vasoconstriction. That's going to increase resistance. Now we have less urine output, so that's going to increase our blood volume and bring the blood pressure back up. All right, now if we look kind of lastly here at the effect of aging, so a couple things. Atherosclerosis, you've probably heard the most about, but there's also arteriosclerosis, so pretty easy to confuse these two. But arteriosclerosis, this is the degenerative changes in the arteries that make them less elastic. So they're less able to constrict and dilate. So they mainly stay constricted. They're less elastic. They can't kind of bounce back. So it makes them, increases that blood pressure that causes a lot of damage. Now, atherosclerosis, this is especially from like fatty diets or poor diets where we get the deposits of plaques that clog our arteries. That's atherosclerosis. So the effects, especially on those medium and large arteries, especially including the coronary arteries that go directly to the heart. So leading to that buildup here of these plaques, now we get an increase of resistance because we have a smaller opening for the blood to move. So that's going to increase the blood pressure and ultimately damages the cardiovascular system. All right, and then just to kind of highlight, we didn't cover here in the lecture, the recorded lecture, all the different types of arteries and veins. That's going to be the lab portion. So there were some sections there in your book that we're not covering right here because they're all the different arteries and veins that we'll hit in lab.